So hi everyone, good morning. Thank you for joining us for OurCrowd's Fund Manager panel. Today we're going to have a unique opportunity to hear firsthand from top fund managers what it actually means to be a successful fund manager. And through personal stories, war stories, that our fund managers will share, we'll try to better understand what it actually means to be a successful manager, the dilemmas, the challenges, and how each and every fund manager is thinking about these issues and addressing them. My name is Etai Kramer. I'm Managing Director at OurCrowd, co-heading OurCrowd's funds business. Quick word about OurCrowd's funds business. OurCrowd's funds business is a growing business. It's a fast-growing business. Since we started focusing on funds, we've raised over $180 million in commitments across 22 funds. And what's interesting about it is, if you think about it, what we were trying to do at the inception of OurCrowd is maybe, in a sense, disrupt what top fund managers have been doing, right? Because what we do is we create value for our investors by providing access to investments in private companies through our platform. But as the business matured, we realized that how do we create value for investors who don't want to go on our platform and pick and choose a single investment opportunity? How do we create value for those investors? And the answer is funds, is actually collaborating with the funds and creating strategic partnerships with top fund managers. And today our investors can invest together with us in top fund managers. So with that, I'd like to introduce our fund managers today. I guess I'll start all the way down there. We have John Backus, Managing Partner at PROOF. For those of you who don't know, PROOF stands for the Pro Rata Opportunity Fund. And what the fund does, it has a sophisticated way to monetize on unexercised preemptive rights or pro rata rights of other reputable micro VCs. And for those of you who want to kind of further elaborate, I'm sure you can catch John after the panel. John is a seasoned tech investor and entrepreneur. He established a company that was IPO'd on NASDAQ in 1995, and since then he's established 3 venture firms, most recently PROOF. It's great having you here, John. Next we have Judah Taub. Judah is managing partner at Hetz Ventures, and for the Israelis in the crowd, like myself, Hetz Ventures. So prior to Hetz is a UK Israeli-based early stage fund. Prior to Hetz, Judah was head of data for a $20 billion hedge fund located in London. Judah was an officer in a highly classified intelligence unit where he won the 2014 Creativity Award. And if I may, he was actually recently recognized by Forbes 30 Under 30 for 2020. So great to have you here, Judah. Next we have Rotem Eldar, managing partner of Ofek Ventures. Ofek is a Tel Aviv-based fund focusing on generally in ICT, but specifically in subsectors where the fund managers have kind of domain expertise. Prior to Ofek, Rotem was partner Gemini Israel, which is one of the pioneers of the Israeli VC ecosystem. He also served in a highly elite tech unit, and for those who know that unit know how impressive that is, where he won the Israel National Security Award for a project he led. Next in line, we have Adam Volkin. Adam is Managing Director at General Catalyst. It's a US-based fund, multi-stage, with $5 billion in commitments. Prior to that, Adam was venture partner at Excel Partners in their London office, and today he's involved directly engaged or on the boards of well-known companies like ClassPass and Fundbox and Vroom. His prior investments include companies like Spotify, Fiverr, and Kenshu. And last but not least, we have Avishai Silvershatz. Avishai is head of the investment committee of a fund called FinTLV. FinTLV is a Tel Aviv-based fund. It specializes in insurtech. So the fund invests only in advanced technologies that will disrupt and really impact the insurance market globally and in Israel as well. In addition, Avishai is the managing partner of Infinity China. It's a China-Israeli-based fund with $1.25 billion under management. Prior to that, Avishai was an entrepreneur. He was co-founder and CEO of 2 companies. Both were IPO'd on NASDAQ. So very, very strong panel. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's dive into the stories. John, perhaps you can share your first story.
Sure. Well, I can't start without noticing we have Corona beer here.
Yeah.
I'm guessing it was on sale.
The OurCrowd way.
So, so when I thought about this, I thought the best way to talk about being successful in venture capital is to talk about failing in venture capital. And so I wanted to tell the story of the worst investment I ever made and what I learned from it. And, one thing you learn in life, but you certainly learn in venture capital, or if you don't learn it, you're going to fail, is you're not as smart as your good investments and you're not as dumb as your bad investments. Luck is involved in the good ones and bad luck is often involved in the bad ones. So my worst investment I made in 2000 in a company called Return Buy. It was a great idea. They basically took all these returned goods from consumer electronics manufacturers and from retailers. Back then it was Palm Pilots and things like that. And they would assess them, they would maybe refurbish them, and they would sell them back then on eBay, and Yahoo and Amazon had sort of emerging auction marketplaces then as well. And the company quickly grew in about 4 years from nothing to about $30 million in revenue. eBay invested. We had some great names in there, and we had almost 10% of our fund in there. We were feeling great. This was going to be a fund maker. It was killing it. It was growing. It had a strategic investor. And I remember one day I'm in a board meeting and the CEO says, we're now selling 700 Palm Pilots a day. I'm like, wow, this is great. He goes, yeah, it's about 80% of all of the Palm Pilots sold on eBay. I'm like, wow, the Palm must love us. He goes, well, not exactly. I'm like, what do you mean not exactly? He said, well, they're getting about 1,500 returns a day. And when you look at Circuit City and Best Buy and all the other retailers, it's about 2,500 returns a day. And all of a sudden in my mind, it was like, we're not solving their problem. Their pile's getting bigger. And, what I learned at that point was that eBay, back in the day, was a very broad market, but a very thin market. It didn't go deep in any category. So we could sell lots of product, but not lots of any of the same product. So that company ended up going out of business. We lost all of our money on it, even though it went from 0 to 30 million in a short number of years. And today, 20 years later, there's a company in our backyard called Optoro that Kleiner Perkins has invested in, that Revolution Growth has invested in, that basically is solving the same problem. The difference today versus 20 years ago is there is a lot more liquidity in the market. The market is bigger, it is deeper. You could sell probably, tens of thousands, if not more than that, of iPhone 9s, iPhone 10s, the Samsung product. You can sell lots of that on the market today. And the lesson there is in venture capital, it's not just about having the right idea, but you have to have the right idea at the right time. Because the right idea at the wrong time, from my experience, is the worst investment you can ever make because you're right. And there's this tendency to keep writing checks because you're right, and you're just thinking that the market's going to materialize just around the corner, and it never does.
So I guess maybe different fund managers will have kind of what to say about timing, and can timing be expected, yes or no? What I wanted to ask you is, you have a company, you have a great team, they're doing well, and then all of a sudden there's some sort of realization moment where you feel like something is going wrong. How does that actually play out? Does it come from the board? Does it come from the CEO? When is the moment of realization where you're saying something is derailing, and then what do you do right after that? How do you wind down, I guess, the company in a graceful manner?
Well, there's no monopoly on moments of realization by VCs. If I'm the one having the moment of realization independently, then something's gone wrong because I would hope the management team would have that moment before I would.
Sure.
At some point, though, ideally the CEO or one of the board members, one of the outsiders realizes something isn't working. At that point, you have to have an honest discussion, with the CEO. And say, if you're pretty much out of cash, then you've got to do a wind down. Are you doing a bankruptcy? Or are you doing an assignment for the benefit of creditors? If you have cash still left, do you just wind it down and shut it down and distribute out the remaining cash? Those are the conversations you have to have. There's another tendency that happens in venture capital with venture capitalists, which is a bit of a moral hazard, which is companies that are going great don't need us as much, and we tend not to spend as much time there when in fact we should spend most of our time, taking that company that's worth $100 million to $1 billion in value, but we tend to get sucked in to the ones that are struggling. And we spend an overabundance of time there if we're not careful, and you have to learn to delegate that to management.
Amazing, and I think that's a great segue, and perhaps Rotem, to your story. I had a sneak peek at the story, and I think it kind of.
Do you want to allow us to?
Sure, for sure, absolutely. Feel free to engage. This is supposed to be a bar. Here we finally got the snapshot of it. So they didn't open the beers, but please feel free, go for it.
Okay. So I think that there are two ways to realize that something goes wrong. Sometimes it's really a moment of realization, as you described. There was a moment in the discussion, and you say, "Hey, this is not going as advertised." And then there is the different scenario when there is something, a chronic disease, and as we know that as human beings, it's very difficult for us to identify chronic processes that evolve over a long period of time, and nothing really dramatic happens. What is your experience? What is the more common realization? The about ones, or the ones that you say, hey, we are telling ourselves stories for 12 months now, we really need to think where we are.
What you hope for is that moment, that blast, that inspiration that says something's not going wrong here, because if it's just sort of not growing as quickly as you like, or it's kind of okay but not great, you tend to have it around forever. And it's sort of like, I sort of look at it as if you're an entrepreneur raising money, the best answer you can get is yes, I'll give you money. The second best answer is a quick no. The worst answer is, well, maybe, let me think about it. And that's the same thing with companies. If it's sort of struggling along, there's this tendency for all the VCs to sort of say, well, there's 5 of us in here, let's give them another $1 million. It's only $200,000 each, and it's the worst decision, in venture that I see is just putting more money in to buy a card at a party round.
So I just want to pause here because I'm conscious of time. Rotem.
Sure. You hear me? So before going into my story, I think that it's a great segue, because I think that most people see the role of a VC, our job is to choose companies, find them, invest in them, and then exit them. But the truth is that the majority of our time is actually on the period of in between making the investment and the eventual outcome, which may be either a good one or a bad one. And that's a long period of 5, 7, 10 years, maybe even more, of ups and downs, of small wins and huge challenges. Periods of fundraising, periods of crisis management, and this is the real work that we need to do. And I think that once you have 8, 10, 12 portfolio companies to support, then you find out that 70 or 80% of your time you're actually dealing with that, and not with finding new investments or anything like that. And my story is no different. I mean, I think that the main challenges are around when to decide that a company deserves a second chance and another support, and when do you decide to let go, or should you support your winners and spend your time with your winners and try to achieve some additional outcome for them, or actually support your less successful companies and try to save them from a write-off. My story is from a seed stage company that I was on the board of a few years back. I was actually not part of the investment decision process. This is a company that I inherited, and the reason I mention it is because the founders there were challenging. Two people with very strong personalities, and they didn't really get along with one another. The company was doing something very, very special, very unique at the time. They were developing some technology around GPU for AI and machine learning. It was the early days of the GPUs. And
I don't know if everybody knows with GPU, but
GPUs, it's
you don't have to go into it. I'm just disclaimer.
Okay, but it was really a unique AI technology. But like many times, the development process took much longer than originally anticipated, and the business milestones were not met, and the company struggled, like many seed stage companies do. The founders started to blame one another for these events, and they found it very difficult to raise additional funding with this situation, because it was very obvious that the two are not getting along. And for us, it was again a struggle of should we try to fix this? Should we try to engage with the company and find a solution, or is it better to just let the company go? Actually, in this case, the founders made it somewhat challenging, but a little bit easier on us, because at some point they just came and said, listen, we don't believe in the company anymore, we don't believe in one another, we're leaving. So, I think that most people at this stage would just say, okay, let's shut the company down. But in this specific situation, actually the two other members of the management team were much better than the original founders. So we ended up working there, and it was 6 months where I became a corporate lawyer, and I know everything about corporate law these days.
My condolences.
And
as a recovering lawyer.
and eventually, we ended up buying the founders out for a very cheap. They wanted out to begin with. We ended up at some point, short period of time, holding 80% of the company. We recapped it. We issued a lot of a new option pool for the other management teams to make them sort of founders in their own company. We injected a little more capital to the company, and we helped them raise their next financial round. And now, 4 or 5 years later, the company is doing very well. It was, for decision making, this was a really hard decision, because that was a lot of time spent on this specific crisis. The eventual outcome is successful, but it could go the other way as well.
So I don't know if anyone else wants to comment. My question is, like you mentioned, you have a portfolio of companies. How do you decide? And it seems like it was, I don't know, a year or two of your life to kind of heal the company. So how do you decide within your existing portfolio, which companies you're actually going to roll your sleeves and you're going to give it all you have and focus on that company as opposed to a different company?
So in general, I'm trying to roll up my sleeve and help every company in my portfolio. Obviously, it's very hard to do, and you only have limited amount of time to do that. But in this specific case, as I mentioned, the founders made it a little bit easier, because I really like the other management members, and if it was up to me, I would have suggested that they become, so that the COO will become the CEO, but making this change without the buy-in of the founders is very difficult. Right. And I'm not sure that it would have gone into that fight if the founders wouldn't have wanted to step down.
So it just sounds to me that there's a rational side and a very emotional side. I don't know if it has to do with connections to the entrepreneurs or the management team in that case, but very insightful. I want to stop here and switch over to you, Adam, and share your story. Thank you.
Yes. So I guess two topics. The one is any advice to be a successful venture capitalist, and the other is a war story. I'm personally still trying to figure out how to be a successful venture capitalist. But and the truth is that anyone who's worked in venture as long as I have, which is about 20 years, is going to have a pretty humble disposition, because it's just a really hard business. And no matter how good you are, you're going to be wrong way more than you could ever imagine. And the difference between the good and the great and the bad investors is not always related to how often they're wrong or right. It's related to when they're right, are they really right? And that often involves some luck, because that's really how the early stage business works. But to be a good venture capitalist, the best thing you could do, especially as a young person, is go work at a very good firm with very good partners that you can learn from, because it is kind of a craft. And if you don't have that opportunity because you're starting your own firm, or for whatever reason there aren't people to learn from, the best thing you can do is get involved with companies where there are other board members that are really phenomenal and learn from them. But however you do it, you've got to figure out how to learn from people that know what they're doing, because it can really shorten the cycles. So, I have more war stories than you would believe, because in addition to having been in this for a long time, I have been an international venture capitalist for my entire career. So I was based in the UK between 1999 and 2013, but focused on European and Israeli investing. So I've gone, from Belarus to Belgrade, Tel Aviv, Paris, Turkey. I've done deals, in almost every city. 7 years ago, I moved back to the US, where I initially started working where I studied, and invest in the US too, although my job at my firm is head of international. So almost every week I'm traveling to some part of the world looking for investments, oftentimes Israel. So with all these places that I've been and companies I've been involved in, I have a pretty good roster of stories, some of which you wouldn't believe if I told you. But a story that I thought appropriate for now takes me back to 2002. And if you guys can all rewind, if you were born, to 2002, that year a company in California went public called Netflix. And they had 600,000 subscribers that essentially received DVDs in the mail. The one thing everyone knew was that was going to grow a lot, because the fundamental customer experience was just so much better than paying late fees to Blockbuster, which was the thing of the day. And you could see that Blockbuster was just getting nailed by them. So we were in the UK at our firm. It was a small firm, and we decided to incubate a company in that space. And a number of other entrepreneurs were also going after it. One of them, a guy named Saul Klein, who's now runs a very well-known seed fund called Local Globe. He went after the same opportunity, backed by Index and Benchmark. There was a third company, a founder named Alex Chesterman, who was also going. So there were 3 startups that were going after building the Netflix in the UK. And I, in addition to being the investor, was also the initial CEO. I was moonlighting as the CEO for the first year until we hired someone. And I got extremely lucky because we acquired a very small company, which was the only company in the UK operational in that space, but it was tiny. It was 2 guys and a dog and a cousin. And they had 2,000 customers that they were sending. The cousin turned out to be a criminal, by the way.
Why don't you tell us that story?
Yeah. So the reason we landed up being the prevailing was really because of this little company we bought, and the founder was 19 years old, and he was totally brilliant. So thank God for that. So we landed up pulling ahead, being the leader, continued to compete, and we were reasonably confident that we could win. Then one day we read that Netflix announces in the press that they're coming to the UK. Now, if Netflix came to the UK, we were toast. Not just us, but our competitors too. Because it was such a hard business operationally. If you think about it back then, the recommendation engine, showing the right movie to the right person, all the complexity around the logistics. So it's extremely advanced technology company. So for 3 months, we were I guess we're dead. Well, luckily we only invested $4 million. And, but between the 3 companies, we were $15 million probably going down the drain. It turned out that Amazon, kind of for a laugh at the time, when they heard Netflix was coming, announced, we're going to enter the DVD rental business in the UK too. And Amazon weren't in that business in the US. And Netflix panicked and said, well, if Amazon's going to do that in the UK, it means they're going to do it in the US. So what's the point of us going to the UK to compete with them when we should just defend our turf? Because that's the core of our business is the US. So literally the day before Netflix was going to launch, the day before, they built a team, built inventory, they closed it down, fired the team, sold the inventory off to us and others, and they were gone. Amazon did, in fact, launch, and they did become our main competitor, but it was never a primary business for them. They didn't really know how to do it. It was kind of done as a side thing to what they were doing with selling DVDs. And we landed up merging with our venture-backed competitors and then buying Amazon's competitor and becoming the dominant monopoly. We had 100% of the market, and we eventually sold the whole thing back to Amazon. Very successful exit, several $100 million. All the people that started those various companies went on to do great things, and actually became a really important company in UK tech Chris Saul, went to Index, then started Local Globe. Alex Chesterman went on to start Zoopla, which was sold for $3.5 billion. Now started a new company called Kazoo, probably the most successful current UK entrepreneur. Graham Barsha, who was the 19-year-old kid in my company, went on to start Graze, which sold for 120 million, then started a company called Tails that he sold for 200 million, and so on and so on. So this whole mafia, I landed up at Excel, and then this whole kind of London mafia from the DVD space really went on to define to a large extent what happened in the UK in tech after that. Truth is, had Netflix just decided to launch in the UK, there would have been no story about us. None of us would have had successful exits, and the whole kind of early phase of UK tech could have been really different. And the only thing that separated path A and path B was luck. And that was a very good thing for me to learn early on, because I really liked what you said in the beginning, is oftentimes the successes are not because you're that smart, but just because you got lucky. But you've got to hustle 100% of the time to get lucky occasionally.
Thank you. I mean, does anybody else have thoughts about how much luck is kind of a key element of successful VC? I'm sure we can have a full panel of that, but I don't know if there's a really good answer to that. Let's pause here and move to Avishai, and hopefully we'll have some time for the crowd as well, and we'll open the mic for the questions. But thank you very much, Adam.
So the story I want to share with you is a story that had a profound impact on myself, on my career, on the way that I perceive many things in life and in business in particular. So this is an important story for me. And most of the time, we brag a lot about the value that we bring to companies, we VCs. But the reality is that the real heroes of the stories are not us, are the executives, are the founders, are the employees. We support them, sometimes we disturb them, and we sit by the wheel in very few cases. One of them is when we need to pull the plug, and this is really a point where we need to play, or when there needs to be a major shift that is beyond the founders, like the story that you saw. But most of the time, we are not the heroes. The more interesting stories for us are the stories where we are really pushed to be the heroes of the story for a moment in the life of a company. So fast backward, some 20 years ago, we had a portfolio company that I inherited from the former generation of fund managers in my fund, Infinity, not far from here, 2 miles from here in Malcha, in Jerusalem. And this company is a company that probably nobody in this audience realizes is serving 1 billion people every day. 1 billion people every day are using this technology that was developed 2 miles from here. They developed a process for manufacturing the camera chips that are inside the phones that each of us has. And so they had a process that reduced the manufacturing cost. The business model and operational model was that chip companies would sell them the chip, they would do the process and send them back. This was the model. And as you know, Israel is famous for many things, but mass production is not one of them. And this was one of these cases of not moment of realization, but chronic decline. We had, again and again, we had issues of quality, of supply, of volume, ability to meet deadlines, cost issues. And there were chronic issues, but slowly, all the smart people around the board realized that we are really going nowhere, because this is really beyond us. And at some point, everybody gave up, and the company was on the verge of bankruptcy, of receivership. This was more or less at the time where we in the fund, in Infinity, we had a change of generation. The founders of the fund phased out, and me and my partner, who were the new generation, phased in. So we had an opportunity to look at an existing portfolio company from fresh eyes, which is really one of the things that happen in this type, in the life cycle of a fund. And we said, okay, this is not a fight that we will win. You will never be able to do mass production here in Jerusalem, not only because we don't know to do mass production, but also because the entire supply chain is farther in China or in Asia. So this is not going to fly. we need to do something. Let's take the technology, use it in China. When we told it to members of our ecosystem, obviously the common wisdom was, guys, you are really crazy. There is nothing to do in China. This was about year 2000. The only thing that you can do in China is cheap T-shirts. Basically, this is the only thing that you can produce in China. You're wasting your time. They will steal your assets. The money will go down the drain, and you're wasting your time and energy. And this was point number one. Point number two was camera chips. Who the hell need a camera in his phone? A camera in a phone, a phone without a camera is like a fish without bicycle, basically. Why do you need a camera? At that point in time, the only people that used cameras in mobile phones were a few people in Japan. And people perceived this to be a very specific, one of these technologies that only succeed in Japan, that it will never find its way outside of Japan. Actually, this was our perception as well, but we thought maybe we will find enough market in Japan for this bizarre feature of telephones that we'll manage. So we went to China, and we had some initial relationship there. We tried to find a partner because this is a capital-intensive venture to build a facility. It was well beyond us. We found a local partner, which was basically the investment arm of one of the cities in China, the city of Suzhou, not far from Shanghai. And basically, they told us something very interesting, and it really surprised us at the time. We said, we are China. We know that the directive of the central government of China is to go higher in the value chain. We need to have advanced technology. We'll do everything it takes to make you guys successful. We'll be your partner, and we'll make you successful, dead or alive. And so this was a long process. They have never done business with Western companies. We have never done business in China. Many dinners, many lunches, liters of excellent alcohol. My ability to consume alcohol increased dramatically during that period. But then we had a deal. We found a manager, the person who can really run this operation in China. And we started this. And we invested, an initial investment was about 10 million, half from us, half from our Chinese partner. But then they invested tens of millions in building the facility. This was in about 2004. And then the volumes grew and grew and grew. And then to our pleasant surprise, we realized that this is not just a unique feature of some Japanese consumers, but also a global emerging standard, de facto standard, that every phone will have cameras. This really took us by surprise. So volume grew from 1,000 to tens of thousands, and then to millions of units. Then in 2014, we took the company public in China, which was extremely unusual event. This is the only public company in China which is really based on Israeli technology. This is one of the very few public companies in China which is really controlled by foreign investors. This is an extremely unusual case. So it was very difficult for the Chinese authorities to digest it. It was also very difficult for us to digest it. But the IPO went well. We still had many challenges beyond that point. Now the company was about $3 billion. We are still major shareholders in the company. So I would say that the main lessons are pretty much the lessons that you all shared before. You never know, for good and for bad. We never knew that cameras will become so prevalent in mobile phones. But we never realized how difficult it will be to cope with the Chinese authorities, for example. Both things took us by surprise over a 20-year period. You don't control it. You need to learn. You need to adapt to many things and there are really many ways to skin a cat. This was a path that nobody tried before. We tried it. You always need to listen to common wisdom, but sometimes do the opposite. And this is also part of what we're being told. I think that VC is one of the businesses when you don't really necessarily try to reach a consensus. Sometimes you say, this is what I think we need to do, and we'll do it, whether the common wisdom is for us or against us. And by the end of the day, the last lesson is the first lesson. It's always about people, about your partners, about the executives, about their determination to do whatever it takes to get it all the way.
Thank you, Avishai. So I want to switch over to you, Judah, and I think, you know, Israel, China, cultural differences, I think it's a good segue to your story.
Fantastic. Yeah, so as Etai mentioned at the very beginning, we're a very early stage VC. We invest in founders who typically have just come out of the army with fantastically crazy, disruptive ideas. And one of the things we try and do, which we think is relatively unique, is take these young entrepreneurs abroad as early as possible. So over the last 2 years, we've probably taken close to 100 entrepreneurs to meet international corporations, and the culture barrier and the differences between these young Israelis and these maybe top executives, sometimes people in the House of Lords that we're trying to introduce them to, has really brought home some ideas and thoughts, and really that's maybe the cultural differences, that just to share a few ideas and things that we've learned over the last few years. And just to bucket them, I thought of just literally giving maybe 2 thoughts on recommendations. So whether you're an investor or a corporate that's now looking at Israeli startups to take them abroad, or if you're the actual entrepreneur and you're going abroad, just to think about before the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting. So very, very briefly, so before the meeting, the obvious story that comes to mind is when we took 2 young entrepreneurs, and I remember saying, I'll meet you outside the headquarters of M&S. This is Marks & Spencer. 2 hours before the meeting, it's formal dressing, and they show up in their suit from their kibbutz wedding 7 years earlier. So those 2 hours was running to an M&S store to buy the suit they should have been wearing earlier. So dress code is not always important, but in some scenarios, and especially, for example, in fintech, and if the buy side usually dresses one way, the sell side sometimes another way, it's something to think about. And maybe the more important thing to think about before the meeting is actually how you want to think, or how you want to end the meeting. So an example that comes to mind here is very recently, one of our very young entrepreneurs met the chief architect of British Telecom. And he's talking to him about virtual machines and load balancing. And after the very short demo, there was like a silence in the room. And this chief architect turns around and says, "That is dark magic." Literally blown away. These 2 young guys have blown him away. And he says, "Okay, what's the next steps?" And then there was another awkward silence. And the Israeli guys are saying, "Well, do you want to buy a product?" to which he responded saying, "Well, don't you guys sort of have an NDA, then a static trial, then a dynamic trial?" And they said, yeah, that's exactly what we've got. The point here is that sometimes before the meeting, the most important thing you can do is actually think about how you want to end the meeting. During the meeting, maybe if I had to make only one recommendation, only one, it would be this, and especially to Israelis, and that is, you are not selling technology, you are selling trust. When you walk into a meeting abroad, the number one thing you are selling is trust. Often, and especially techies, think that if they manage to get through their 20-slide presentation, it was a successful meeting. And if the other guy on the other side of the table didn't ask a question, that's absolutely fine. As long as they can get from slide 1 to slide 20 with all the bullet points and the guys heard everything literally from them, that's a success. And the truth is, even if the conversation ended at slide 3, but you had a nice chat beforehand, you've scheduled a follow-up meeting, ideally you're going to drink sometime that week while you're in town, the chances of you cutting a deal is infinitely higher. You are selling trust much more than technology. The technology will follow the trust. The trust, it's much harder to sell the trust after the technology. And maybe the other point I would make about during the meeting is, or I'd ask yourselves this. If you were asked during a meeting, what data are you able to collect? The answer to that question heavily depends on the person that is asking it from the corporate side. If it's the chief legal officer, you want to give a very different answer to if it's the chief analytics officer. And very often, especially if you're in this sort of 20-slide blitz, you're giving the wrong answer to the wrong person. So you've come to the meeting, there's a few extra people showed up, thinking about who those people are, what's actually important to them is sometimes the most critical element. And then just finally, one thing to think about after the meeting is how you follow up. So at our fund, we've recently gone through a hiring process, and we interviewed 25 candidates, 3 of which moved to Israel very recently. And only 3 of them, and it was these exact 3, wrote a follow-up email afterwards, and 22 didn't. And not only that, these 3 wrote a follow-up email saying, thank you for your time, I very much enjoyed, and there was something to do with the conversation that we had. The point I would make here is, and especially if you believe that the trust is the main thing you're selling here, the follow-up email afterwards, finding something in that conversation, sometimes not even to do with the product. If you find out that the guy happened to be a Liverpool fan, it's a shame. But afterwards, when Liverpool happens to play a game 2 days later, a week later, dropping him a note, or her, is probably going to have as much of an effect, if not more, than when you send your tech DD bullet to them and they have to try and think how they're going to figure this out afterwards. So maybe those are a few cultural points that we're thinking about.
So just as an Israeli, defending the Israeli side of this great analysis, I mean, you know, when a corporate or whatever, you know, very polished says to an Israeli no, what we're actually hearing is definitely maybe, right? And that's kind of, so the question is, can you actually prepare or educate or gap that fundamental difference in cultures?
I mean, I'm sure other people have lots of experience. From my experience, yes, it's something that the main thing that we try and do here is hopefully cram down what could be a very long learning process into a relatively short period of time. Israelis are extremely bright. The guys we work with are nearly always very receptive. They want to learn, they want to succeed, and just understanding that sometimes the culture is just as important as the technology is a key to success.
Yeah, so I think Judah's kind of touching on an important kind of central theme here, and maybe just to add to it or kind of put a different point here. So it's quite common for entrepreneurs, and I think certainly for Israeli entrepreneurs, to have, especially when they've worked on something for like years, that is incredibly complex, and they've been very thoughtful and creative about getting to where they are. They sort of feel the need to articulate everything they've done and take people through the journey and make sure people understand every aspect of what is so special here. But in truth, this is like human nature, is most people can only remember 2 or 3 or maybe 4 things from a meeting. So the real question for the founder is, what are those 2 or 3 things that you want them to remember? And also, how do you want them to talk about it when they go talk to their partners or other stakeholders afterwards? And that's like the much more important thing, because what you're really trying to do is get a second meeting or get a follow-up or do some kind of proof of concept or trial. And that is always going to be done based on a soundbite that is compelling. So as a founder talking to, whether it's an investor or a business partner, the question you're asking is, how is this person going to turn around to their team in 90 seconds and explain what I'm doing? That's really the challenge.
Thank you. Very insightful. Thank you.
I would like to continue on this thread. One of the roles that we do have in some cases is the role of mentors. Mentor is it's a very high term, but we do have some mentorship work that in some cases we are entitled to do. And indeed, some of the things are exactly the things that you just mentioned. Most of the entrepreneurs are engineers. And engineers, by their very DNA, used to give accurate answer. If he looks back and the answer he gives, he will say, okay, was I accurate or not? This is his criteria for giving a good answer. And I think one of the things that I think that this comes in both of these stories, is to tell him, no, this is not just about providing information. You have a goal in this dialogue, and you need to understand what is the motivation behind the question. What are the things that you want to highlight? What are the things that you want to highlight first? This is not the way. This is not a natural way for an engineer to think about a dialogue. But this is something that we need to help them internalize in order to be successful when they move from being an engineers to being executives.
I would add 2 things, which is for an audience remembers 3 things. They remember a picture, they remember a story, They don't remember facts. They don't remember bullet points. They'll remember a soundbite. And the second thing I'll add to the conversation is, if you're an entrepreneur giving a pitch, don't have 18 pages of product features. Features don't convince anyone, much less us. Tell us about the problems you're solving. Because customers care about a problem being solved. We care about you solving a problem. The features are just a means to that.
Just one last word of a different perspective. I think that we're being very harsh on the Israeli entrepreneur in this panel. I think that one of the reasons that the Israeli entrepreneurs are so successful are because they're a little bit different. They have this a sense of a little bit of the chutzpah, and that they don't take no for an answer.
That's probably a panel right there, in like 50 minutes.
So it's right that we need to mentor them to understand the cultural differences and everything, but there are some things that they're doing actually better without really understanding how they need to behave, and the results are outstanding.
Well, there's another reason why Israeli founders, I think, are doing so well now and will do so well over the next 20 years, is many of them are on the second company, where they made some of those mistakes and learned some of the hard lessons, and now they are ready to go. And that's what, certainly for us, when we come here and meet 10 or 20 companies on a trip, like 90% of them will be second or third company.
That's a totally another panel that we can have on that as well.
So unfortunately, we already ran out of time. Apologies. But I want to thank our amazing fund managers. It was really, there's so many sound bites here. So thank you, everyone.